Hello, friends. You know, reality is a fickle thing. It often throws us stories that make any Hollywood fantasy seem pale in comparison. And today, you will learn how an enormous passenger Boeing transformed into a silent glider at an altitude of 12 kilometers due to a schoolboy error in mathematics. Why did an entire city decide to bury its streets alive and build a new life right on top of the old houses? And how did one man manage not just to survive, but to live another 60 years after 9 bullets from a firing squad and a final shot to the head? Before we begin, please give us a like and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And now, let's go. Story number 1. A flight that forgot to refuel. You know, we tend to trust technology. We look at those giant airliners and think, well, everything is calculated down to the millimeter. There are computers, redundant systems, intelligent algorithms. But on July 23, 1983, it became evident that even the most advanced computer is powerless against simple human stupidity and the confusion between liters and gallons. Picture this: Canada, at an altitude of 12,000 meters. A brand new Boeing 767. This was the pride of the fleet, literally a marvel of technology with a digital cockpit. On board were 61 passengers and 8 crew members. They were flying from Montreal to Edmonton, serving dinner. Some were reading newspapers, others dozing off. A typical boring flight routine. And suddenly, a beep. A warning light goes on in the cockpit, indicating low fuel pressure in the left engine. The pilots, Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal, frown. The computer shows everything is fine, but the light is on. They suspect it's a sensor malfunction. A new plane can't have problems, right? Then the left engine just cuts out. Listen, that's terrifying. But Boeing has a second engine. You can fly on one engine. The pilots begin their descent, preparing for an emergency landing in Winnipeg. They are calm. These are professionals. But a couple more minutes pass, and something happens that, in principle, should never be. Another signal goes off. A long, unpleasant sound that the pilots had never even heard in simulators. Beep, beep, beep. The second engine shuts down, and then there is silence. Not the kind of silence when you turn off the TV, but total, dead silence at an altitude of 12 kilometers. The plane, a machine weighing over 100 tons, becomes like a brick. The electricity goes out. The screens, those very technological wonders, turn black. The aircraft is powerless because the generators are driven by the engines. The cabin lights go out. All that can be heard is the whistle of the wind outside. You know why this happened? It's just laughable if it weren't so terrifying. On the ground, the technicians mixed up the system. Canada was just transitioning to the metric system. They filled the fuel in liters, but the onboard computer calculated it as pounds, or vice versa. In short, a simple math mistake at a 5th grade level. And now, the plane was a hollow tank in the sky. But the passengers had one stroke of luck. Captain Pearson, in his spare time, flew gliders. You know, those lightweight planes without engines. And he realized that he wasn't flying a Boeing, he was simply maneuvering a very large, very heavy, and very fast glider. The second pilot, Quintal, remembered, there's an old military base in Gimli nearby. Let's go there, he shouted. They turned this massive aircraft around without hydraulics, literally using just muscle power because the controls had turned to stone. They approached Gimli, and then a tiny detail came to light that Quintal didn't know. The base had been closed for a long time, and the runway was now a racetrack for the local car club. And today, that Saturday, there was a celebration. Families, children, barbecues, go-kart racing, people grilling sausages, drinking lemonade, and right above them, 100-ton Silver Death silently descended from the sky. Pearson understood he was too high and flying too fast. There were no brakes, the flaps weren't working. If he just went for a landing, he would overshoot the runway and crash into the woods or into people. Then he did something insane, a maneuver called a wing skid. He positioned the massive passenger plane sideways to the wind, like a fighter jet or a sport glider. The passengers in the cabin saw the ground not below them, but to the side, through the windows. The airplane fell like a stone, losing speed. At the last moment before hitting the ground, he leveled the aircraft. The landing gear dropped under their own weight, but the front strut did not lock. The plane touched down on the concrete. People on the ground ran in fear. Two boys on bicycles pedaled as fast as they ever had in their lives, glancing back at the giant nose of the plane rushing right behind them. The Boeing pitched forward, the front wheel collapsed, and with a horrific screech, sending up fountains of sparks, it slid nose first along the concrete. Sparks, dust, smoke, and it stopped a few dozen meters away from the people with their barbecues. Inside the cabin, there was a deathly silence, followed by an explosion of panic. But you know what? No one died. Not a single person. A few bruises during the evacuation down the inflatable slides. That was all the injuries. Captain Pearson exited the cockpit, looked at the worn nose of the aircraft, and probably exhaled so deeply that his breath could have been heard in space. This story came to be known as the Gimli glider. The airplane was repaired right there at the airfield. It took off again 2 days later and served the airline for another 25 years. But this incident forever remained a reminder. You can build the smartest machine in the world, but if you skipped math in school, not even the sky will save you. However, sometimes it's the sky that gives a second chance, especially when the right person is at the controls. But what happens when the right person is not around, and there's just a crazy idea? The most expensive sawmill in history. Wars usually start over oil, religion, or land. But sometimes humanity is ready to spark a third world war over landscape design. Seriously, over just one tree. Let's travel to August 1976, to the border between North and South Korea, the demilitarized zone, the most tense place on the planet, where people watch each other through scopes 24 hours a day. In the center of that zone, right by the Bridge of No Return, stood Rostopol, a massive old poplar tree. And it had one problem. In the summer, its thick foliage completely blocked the view between the UN observation post and the checkpoint. American officers could not see their own. This was dangerous. On August 18th, a group of 5 American and South Korean soldiers, armed with ordinary garden axes, set out just to trim some branches. A peaceful, routine procedure. But as soon as they started, North Korean soldiers appeared. At first, they just watched. Then, their lieutenant ordered them to stop, claiming that the tree had been planted personally by their leader. The Americans naturally continued, and then the lieutenant took off his watch, wrapped it in a cloth, put it in his pocket, and commanded his men, "Kill them." The North Koreans grabbed the axes from the workers and killed 2 American officers on the spot, right there in the foliage. The world froze. This was an act of war. President Gerald Ford was furious. North Korea anticipated a retaliation. Everyone expected bombings, tanks, anything. But the Americans devised a plan that went down in history as Operation Paul Bunyan. They decided not to bomb North Korea. They decided to cut down that damn tree, but to do it in a way that would make Kim Il-sung tremble. 3 days later, on August 21st, at dawn, the operation commenced. 2 trucks approached the tree. From them emerged engineers with chainsaws, but they were not alone. They were protected by a platoon of special forces, 64 South Korean soldiers. And these were not just any soldiers. They were Taekwondo masters, dressed in bulletproof vests with batons and concealed M16 rifles beneath their clothing. Additionally, claymore mines were strapped to their chests. They were ready to blow themselves up along with the enemy, but this was just the beginning of the show. In the sky above them hovered 27 American helicopters. Just above them were Phantom fighters and bombers. Higher in the stratosphere were B-52 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons. In the Sea of Japan, the aircraft carrier Midway was deployed with a full escort of ships. And at the border, 12,000 soldiers, 12,000 had artillery on full combat readiness. Imagine the scene. There stands a tree. Around it, chainsaws are buzzing, and all the military might of a superpower is poised to reduce half the peninsula to dust if a single shot is fired. The North Koreans brought 150 of their soldiers with rifles to the bridge. They watched as the Americans cut. The air was filled with the roar of helicopters and the whine of saws. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. One mistake, one nervous breakdown from any soldier, and a nuclear war would break out. The engineers worked for 42 minutes. They felled the poplar, leaving only a tall stump, a monument to foolishness. The North Koreans never dared to attack. They merely stood and watched as their sacred tree turned to sawdust under the gaze of an armada. The operation ended without a single shot being fired. It was the most expensive logging operation in human history. Millions of dollars spent on fuel and logistics for one old poplar. The stump stood there until 1987, when it was replaced with a concrete monument. This story is a perfect example of how far people are willing to go for a principle. Sometimes, to prove a point, words are not enough. Sometimes, an aircraft carrier needs to be guided. But if everything here has ended in farce, the next story shows that sometimes human stubbornness leads not to a display of strength, but to a tragedy that cannot be explained by logic. This is story number 4. A flight to a white nowhere, Antarctica. The most beautiful and yet the most merciless place on Earth. In the late 70s, an airline decided that it was not enough for people to just watch it on television. They came up with weekend flights. Imagine, you board a comfortable airliner in warm New Zealand, sip champagne, eat lobsters, while eternal ice and icebergs drift by outside the window. Then the plane makes a turn and brings you back home for dinner. Sounds like a dream, right? On November 28, 1979, Flight 901 took off from Auckland. There were 257 people on board. The mood was festive. Captain Jim Collins was an experienced pilot, but it was his first time flying to Antarctica. However, he was not worried. He had a clear flight plan programmed into the onboard computer. The computer was the brain of the airplane. The pilots trusted it without reservation. The flight plan was simple. Fly to McMurdo Sound, descend for a better view, display the sights to the tourists, and return. The route passed over the flat ice of the strait, where there were no obstacles. But there was one detail, a tiny detail. The night before the flight, the controllers in the control center changed the coordinates of one of the waypoints by just a couple of degrees. They thought they were merely clarifying the route, but no one informed the crew about this. The new coordinates directed the plane not over the safe strait, but straight towards Mount Erebus, an active volcano nearly 4,000 meters high. The airplane approached Antarctica. Captain Collins began the descent. The clouds were low, but the visibility under the clouds was excellent. At least, that is what it seemed to them. And then, the deadliest killer of polar latitudes came into play, the sectoral whiteout. This is an optical illusion where sunlight passes through the clouds and reflects off the snow at such an angle that shadows disappear, the horizon erases, and sky and earth become one milky white canvas. The pilots looked out the window. They saw flat white ice ahead. They were sure they were flying over McMurdo Sound, just as planned. The computer confirmed it. The course was correct. Their eyes confirmed it. There was emptiness ahead. In reality, directly in front of them, looming over the horizon, was a gigantic mountain. But its slopes were covered in snow, blending in with the clouds. The black rocks were hidden. For the pilots, the mountain had become invisible. They were not flying blindly through fog. They were flying in clear weather, straight into a wall their brains refused to see. A calm voice from the engineer speaks in the cockpit. "Erebus should be somewhere around here." The captain replies, "Yes, I'm looking for it now." He was looking right at it, and did not see it. Just seconds before the end, an alarm sounded for dangerous proximity to the ground. Up, pull up!" Captain Collins reacted instantly. He pushed the throttle to full power and pulled the yoke towards himself, but the enormous airliner had inertia. It needed time. At 1350, the airplane crashed into the slope of Mount Erebus. Instant death for all 257 individuals. The rescuers who arrived at the scene were met with a horrifying sight. A black stripe of soot on the pristine white snow, as if someone had drawn with a marker on a sheet of paper. The passengers' watches found at the site continued to tick, counting down the time their owners no longer had. The investigation was lengthy and scandalous. The airline tried to shift the blame onto the pilots, claiming they had descended below the permitted altitude. However, Judge Peter Mahan, who presided over the case, uttered the famous phrase about organized flight lies. He proved that the pilots were led into a trap, having their coordinates altered without warning. This disaster changed aviation, but what's even more unsettling is its ordinariness. People perished not because of a storm or engine failure. They died because their eyes and brains deceived them, painting a horizon where death awaited. Sometimes, what we see with our own eyes is the greatest lie. And if nature disguised danger here with the color white, in the next story, danger emerged from a place least expected, from a childhood dream that turned into a nightmare. Story number 5. The most drunken war in history. We are accustomed to thinking of war as associated with blood, mud, and tragedy. Yet, somewhere at the edge of the world, amidst the Arctic ice, a war raged for almost half a century, where the primary weapons were not bullets, but bottles of fine alcohol. Imagine a piece of rock in the middle of an icy strait, Hans Island, a tiny lifeless spot the size of a football field. No fish, no gold, not even decent grass, just rocks and wind. However, it sits precisely between Greenland, which belongs to Denmark, and Canada. Then, in 1984, patience ran thin. Canada decided, this is ours. They landed troops on the island, raised the Canadian flag, and to solidify their victory, they left a bottle of Canadian whiskey by the flagpole, kind of a know our presence. The Danes found out about this. The minister for Greenland personally flew to the island by helicopter. Danish soldiers took down the Canadian flag, folded it carefully, and raised their own Danish flag. Nearby on the rocks, they left a bottle of Danish schnapps and a note, "Welcome to Danish territory." Thus, the Whiskey War began. For decades, the tough military sailors and border guards of both countries played this odd game. The Canadians arrived, took down the Danish flag, seized the schnapps. I hope they drank it rather than poured it out. They raised their flag, left whiskey, Canadian Club, and a note. Welcome to Canada. A couple of months later, the Danes would show up, take down the Canadian flag, drink or take the whiskey, raise their flag, and leave schnapps behind. This was the perfect conflict. Not a single shot fired, not a single injury. Just a slight hangover for the invaders. The world watched this with a smile. Diplomats issued notes of protest, while the military carried on with their barter. One day in 2005, Canadian Defense Minister Bill Graham landed on the island for a stroll. Denmark lodged an official protest, calling it an occupation. Newspapers came out with headlines about the invasion, but everyone understood this was just another round of alcohol diplomacy. The internet even provided its own solutions. Someone suggested resolving the dispute with a pillow fight, while others proposed leaving the island to the non-existent penguins. But what's most amusing about this story is how it ended. In June 2022, when the world was facing real and terrifying conflicts, Denmark and Canada decided, enough drinking. They sat down at the negotiation table and simply divided the island in half, drawing a line right across the rock. Now, Canada and Denmark have a shared land border through Greenland, the first in history. The Whiskey War is officially over. This story is a rare ray of light. It shows that even territorial disputes can be resolved humanely, with humor, respect, and a good drink. If all wars in the world were fought this way, come, leave a bottle, and go, the world would be a much nicer place. Unfortunately, not all stories end with a toast. Sometimes human ingenuity leads to not-so-funny traditions and to monsters that make us want to hide under the covers. Story number 6. A heist in Canada. When we think of the perfect robbery, we imagine a bank, lasers, masked men, and bags filled with diamonds. But in Canada, the criminal world operates a little differently. There, the main treasure is neither gold nor money. It is a sticky, sweet, amber-colored liquid, maple syrup. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. Maple syrup costs more than oil, much more. In the province of Quebec, there exists a place that sounds like a fantasy, but it's real. The Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve. It's a huge storage facility the size of several football fields. Inside, White barrels hold reserves of liquid gold in case of a bad harvest. In 2011, a group of people decided that $18 million was too much to just sit in barrels. But how do you stealthily take away 3,000 tons of syrup? They didn't blast walls or take hostages. They rented a part of the same warehouse pretending to be another company and began to act quietly, methodically, and domestically. Every night the thieves snuck into the storage. They approached the stacks of barrels. Climbing to the top was dangerous as the barrels could fall, so they only siphoned syrup from the bottom rows. They unscrewed the caps, inserted pumps, and transferred the syrup into their tankers. But then a problem arose. A full barrel weighs almost 660 pounds. An empty one weighs just a few dozen. If they left them empty, someone would notice they were too light, or the stack would simply collapse. That's when the thieves demonstrated true Canadian ingenuity. They brought water with them. They poured water back into the barrel so that the weight matched. The operation lasted for months. They worked like ants, hauling out syrup and selling it to dealers on the black market. Yes, there's a black market for syrup. They laundered the money. They stole almost 10,000 barrels. 6 million pounds of syrup vanished. The whole scheme came to light randomly and quite foolishly. One day, a reserve inspector was conducting a routine check and decided to climb to the top row of barrels. It's usually difficult, as the barrels are packed tightly. But this time, one of the barrels under his foot wobbled. It was empty. The thieves had become lazy at some point and had stopped adding water. The inspector tapped on the barrel. The sound was hollow. He opened it. It was empty. He opened the neighboring one. Water. Panic began to rise. The police cordoned off the area. It turned out that 60% of the supply had simply evaporated. This was dubbed the Great Maple Syrup Heist. The police arrested 17 people. The gang leader received 8 years in prison and a fine of $9 million. The funniest part of this story is that syrup cannot be marked like banknotes. It cannot be traced by a serial number. Most likely, you, buying pancakes in a cafe somewhere in 2012, drizzled them with that very stolen syrup without even suspecting you were carrying evidence in a case worth $18 million. By the way, the judge who passed the sentence said that the thieves acted out of insatiable greed, but I think there was also incredible patience involved. Pumping 3,000 tons of liquid by hand is, hard work. It's a shame they didn't direct that energy towards something legal, like baking waffles. And now, let's shift from sweet to salty and very deep, to where people perform feats not for money, but simply to survive in a can at the bottom of the sea. Story number 7. A parcel with a human soul. Freedom. How much does it cost? For some, millions. For others, life. For Henry Brown, the price of freedom equaled the cost of a postage stamp and a few boards. Virginia, 1849. Henry is a slave. He works at a tobacco factory. He had a wife and children, but they were sold to another master. He watched as they were led away in chains. At that moment, something broke within him and simultaneously was born. He decided, I am no longer a thing. I am a man, and I will be free or dead. But how to escape? Slaves are watched over, patrols with dogs on every road. If caught, they would be beaten to death. And then an idea came to Henry's mind, a crazy, claustrophobic idea. If he is a thing in the eyes of the law, then why not send this thing by mail? He found an accomplice, a white shopkeeper who sympathized with the slaves and loved money. They constructed a wooden box. The dimensions were comical, 90 centimeters long, 80 high, 60 wide. Imagine a large box that once held an old television. An adult man would have to sit there, knees pulled to his chin, like an embryo. Henry took with him a water skin and a drill to make air holes. On the lid, they wrote in large letters, "Fragile cargo, this side up," and "Handle with care." The address was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There, slavery did not exist. On March 29th, he climbed inside. The lid was nailed shut. Darkness, tightness, panic. The parcel was handed over to the Adams Express courier service, and hell began. The loaders, of course, did not read the labels. The box was thrown around, turned upside down. At one point, Henry found himself upside down, and he remained that way for several hours. Blood rushed to his head. His eyes felt like they would burst. The veins in his temples bulged. He felt like he was dying. He wanted to scream, to ask them to turn the box over, but he understood that one sound would mean the end: death or slavery. He endured. He prayed in the train, in the wagon, on the steamboat. He was tossed around, shaken, slammed against the walls. The journey lasted 27 hours. 27 hours in the fetal position, in complete darkness, not knowing where you are being taken or if you will arrive alive. Finally, Philadelphia. The Office of Abolitionists, people fighting against slavery. They received a notification about a shipment. 4 men stood around a wooden crate, afraid to open it. They thought they would find a corpse inside. One of them took a hammer, tapped, and the nails creaked. The lid flew off. From the crate, slowly rising with the creaking of stiff joints, emerged a sweaty, weary, but alive man. Henry Brown straightened up, looked at the stunned white men, and, like a true gentleman, said, "How do you do, gentlemen?" Then he sang a psalm of thanks to God. Henry earned the nickname Box after the crate. He became a symbol of resourcefulness and an indomitable will for freedom. He toured, sharing his story, and even made that very box a part of his show. Think about that when you complain about being cramped in a minibus or economy class of an airplane. A man spent a full day in a wooden coffin hanging upside down just to have the right to say, "I belong to myself." But sometimes, to survive, you need not hide in a box, but instead, step into the light and do something so audacious that no one will believe their eyes. Like the man who sold something that didn't belong to him and didn't even bat an eye. This is story number 8, The Emperor of Emptiness. You see, there are people who are just bored with being rich. Yachts, mansions, and champagne are not enough for them. They need something more. For example, their own country, and ideally an empire. Meet Jacques Lebaud, a Frenchman, heir to a vast sugar fortune. In the early 20th century, he had so much money that he could buy half of Paris. But Jacques didn't want Paris. Jacques wanted a crown. In 1903, he outfitted his luxurious yacht, the Frasquita. He gathered a crew of sailors, adventurers, and drifters, promising them mountains of gold. They sailed south to the shores of Africa, and then they landed on the coast of modern Western Sahara. Nothing around, only sand, wind, and the ocean. A desert. The perfect place, Jacques decided. He pulled out a sword, drove it into the dune, and loudly declared, "From this moment, these lands belong to me. I proclaim the establishment of the Sahara Empire." He naturally appointed himself Emperor Jacques I. This was no game. He was completely serious. He ordered his men to build a capital. It was named Troy. Why not? Tents and some meager structures began to rise in the sands. Jacques walked around in a uniform adorned with medals he had invented for himself and issued decrees. He wrote letters to world leaders, the King of England, the President of France, the President of the United States. "Greetings, colleague. I, Emperor Jacques I, propose to establish diplomatic relations." European newspapers were thrilled. They printed cartoons, laughed, calling him the Sugar Emperor, a play on words, sugar business and Sahara. But Jacques believed it was just envy. Meanwhile, problems began to arise. It turned out there was no water in the desert. Who would have thought, right? The emperor's subjects, those same hired sailors, started to grumble. They want to drink, eat, and go home. But Jacques orders them to march and salute. Soon, 5 sailors run up. They are captured by local nomads, the Maoris, and sold into slavery. Emperor Jacques reacts brilliantly. He demands that France declare war on the Maoris to rescue his subjects. The French government rolls their eyes and sends a cruiser to bring this crazy man home before he ignites an international conflict. Jacques is evacuated. The empire of the Sahara lasted a couple of months before it vanished into the sands. But do you think he calmed down? No. Jacques moved to New York. He settled in the most expensive hotel and continued to demand to be called Your Majesty. He walked down Broadway in his imperial uniform. One day, he went into stores and tried to buy an entire fire truck because he liked their helmets. The end of this story is tragic and absurd, just like the life of the emperor. In 1919, he was shot by his own wife. The reason? Jacques claimed he wanted to export their daughter to his non-existent empire to continue the dynasty. His wife decided she had had enough. The jury acquitted her. They decided that killing a crazy emperor who was threatening a child was self-defense. Jacques Le Boutilh remains in history as a man who had everything but wanted more. He bought himself a title, an army, and land, but he could not buy the most important: common sense and respect. The sands of the Sahara remember much, but they erase the name Jacques I faster than the footprints on the beach during high tide. However, sometimes madness is quiet, hiding not in the desert but behind the walls of an ordinary home, where possessions are valued more than people. Story number 9. The Ship That Ascended a Mountain. Let me ask you, have you ever wondered what a person driven by greed is capable of? Not just wanting a new car, but a greed that burns through the mind and makes one argue with the very laws of physics. The end of the 19th century. The Amazon is a true green hell. At this time, the world had gone mad for rubber. Tires, insulation, shoes, all demanded rubber. Rubber barons lived like gods, building opera houses in the middle of jungles and sending laundry to Paris just to have it washed there. Among them was a man named Carlos Fermín Fitzcarrald. Frankly, he was quite a daredevil, half Peruvian, half American. He was looking for a way to reach untouched rubber forests in the upper reaches of the Madre de Dios River. But there was one problem: a geographical dead end. Two mighty rivers were separated by a ridge, a tall mountain covered in dense forest. To get from one river to the other, one would have to travel thousands of kilometers around. But Fitzcarrald didn't want to detour. He wanted to go straight through. In 1894, he decided to do the impossible. He decided to drag his steamboat, the Cantana, over this mountain. Imagine, 30 tons of steel, a steam boiler, huge paddles. This is not a boat, it's a true river monster. And it needed to be lifted several hundred meters through jungles where there were no roads, only the mud of Ileana. Do you think he dismantled the ship into parts? Not at all. Fitzcarraldo decided to pull it whole. He gathered hundreds of natives from the Feather tribe, 100 people who had never seen such machines. He promised them something. However, he didn't promise them anything. He simply made them work. They cleared a path. They felled ancient trees, turning them into logs for the rollers. At first, everything went well, but then the incline began. Imagine this picture. The sun blazes down from above. The humidity is so high that clothes rot right on the body. Within a few days, millions of insects swarm around, and there are naked, exhausted people pulling enormous winches. The metal cables are pulled tight, ringing like guitar strings. If such a cable snaps, it would slice a person in half. And they did snap. The ship moved a few centimeters an hour. By day it was pulled, and by night it could slide down, destroying everything in its path. People died by the dozens, from malaria, from exhaustion, under the weight of steel. Why? For what purpose? So that one man could become even richer. At some point, the natives rebelled. They decided that this iron beast was a curse from the gods, but Fitzcarraldo had rifles, an argument hard to dispute. And you know what's the wildest part? He did it. After a few months of suffering, the Cantama was indeed on top of the mountain, and then it was lowered down the other side into the waters of the Madre de Dios. The steamer entered the river where no one expected to see it. Fitzcarraldo opened a path to unimaginable wealth. He became incredibly rich. He was called the King of Rubber. He proved that the will of man is stronger than nature. But nature is a vengeful lady. It does not forgive such insults. Just 3 years later, in 1997, Carlos Fitzcarraldo was sailing on his other steamboat down the Urubamba River. The ship hit a reef. The very man who made the ship climb the mountain could not keep it afloat. He drowned. He was only 35 years old. Today, the isthmus through which he dragged the steel is named after him. Rusty pieces of metal and fragments of chains are still found there. The jungle swallowed up everything else. Story number 10. The bridge that got lost in the desert. Listen, have you ever bought something really big? Well, not a house or even a yacht, but say an entire town. Or, for example, the legendary stone bridge over the Great River. Honestly, most of us count the change in a store 3 times, but Robert McCulloch was a different kind of man. He was the type of American millionaire who acts first and then checks whether he broke the laws of physics. Imagine, the end of the 1960s, Arizona, a place called Lake Havasu City. Though, to be honest, calling it a city was pure mockery. It was just a patch of scorching desert, sand, cacti, scorpions, and heat so intense that your brain starts melting by noon. McCulloch bought land here to build the city of his dreams, but there was one problem. People didn't want to buy land in a wasteland. They needed something special, some aspect that would make them want to drop everything and move to this oven. And then McCulloch learned some news. In London, yes, the very same foggy London is selling a bridge. A genuine London bridge from the year 1831. You see, the old stone giant simply couldn't cope anymore. It was literally sinking in the Thames under the weight of modern cars. The city authorities decided, let's take it apart and build a new one. But what to do with the old one? Not just throw it away. They put it up for auction, and a man named McCulloch raised his hand. $2,460,000, he said. A pause, and with the sound of the hammer, it was sold to a man from the desert. Do you think he bought it to place in his garden? Not at all. A process began that would give any logistician a heart attack. Workers in London started taking the bridge apart, stone by stone. 10,000 tons of granite. Each block, each brick was carefully numbered. Number 1, number 2, number 3, 854. So that later on they could assemble this gigantic puzzle. Then everything was loaded onto ships across the ocean, through the Panama Canal to a port in California, and from there, by trucks, through the entire desert. Imagine the face of an ordinary farmer, seeing a piece of British history being hauled past his house on a trailer. But here's the funniest part. Do you know what? When the bridge was brought to Arizona, there was no water underneath it at all. The bridge stood in the middle of the sand, like some forgotten artifact of an alien civilization. But McCulloch didn't blink an eye. He said, if there's no river, we'll dig one. And they dug an entire canal under the bridge to turn a piece of desert into an island. They recreated an English village around it, red telephone booths, pubs among the cacti, and 45-degree heat in the shade. Rumors spread that McCulloch was clueless, that he thought he was buying the Tower Bridge, the one with the towers and drawbridge parts. It was a great story for the newspapers, but in reality, he knew exactly what he was getting. He didn't need a symbol. He needed wildness, and he got it. In October 1971, the bridge was officially opened. The Lord Mayor of London flew to Arizona, sweating in his heavy velvet outfit, probably wondering where he had ended up. And you know what? The plan worked. McCulloch's madness paid off. People came to see the bridge lost in the sands. The town came alive. Today, it's a popular destination, and the bridge is still there. It stands firmly anchored in the Arizona earth and seems almost stunned by how far it has drifted from the Thames. This is a story about how, if you have a goal and enough audacity, even an old bridge can make a world tour. The key is to properly number the bricks. However, sometimes people find not just old stones in the ground, but things that can change our understanding of what it means to be human. And sometimes these discoveries leave us stunned with horror or with delight. Story number 11. A race with death in an icy hell. Listen, have you ever felt real cold? Not the kind that makes you want to put on a warmer sweater, but the kind that digs into your lungs, where every breath burns from within, as if you're swallowing broken glass. Imagine a place cut off from the world, 1,000 kilometers of ice and darkness, and imagine that children start dying there. January 1925. Alaska, the small town of Nome. The winter that year was, to be honest, incredibly harsh even by local standards. The town is squeezed between the frozen sea and the endless tundra. Navigation is closed. Forget about airplanes. Those tiny Cornish planes that existed in Alaska simply wouldn't have started. And if they had, the storm would have torn them to shreds. In this icy trap, diphtheria begins to spread, a terrifying disease that suffocates children. The only doctor in town, Dr. Curtis Welch, ran out of serum last summer. He sends out a radio message. We need help. Urgently. The nearest fresh supply of medicine is in Anchorage, which is over 1,000 kilometers away. The train can only reach the Nenana station. There is no more railroad. Beyond that, there is only snow, wolves, and wind. The authorities decide to organize a relay of dog sled teams, 20 mushers and 150 dogs. They must transport a box of serum across all of Alaska. Under normal circumstances, this journey takes 25 days, but the children in Nome don't have 25 days. They have at most 6. And so, on January 27th, the first musher picks up the precious package. 52 degrees below zero. Darkness. You can't see your own hands on the sled's handle. Imagine Leonard Seppala. He was a legendary figure. His team was led by a dog named Togo. You know, everyone remembers Balto, but the true hero of that race was Togo. Seppala faced the most dangerous stretch of the journey. To save time, he decided to travel straight across the ice of Norton Sound. It was pure suicide. The ice beneath the dog's paws cracked and shifted. A blizzard raged around them. Visibility was zero. At any moment, the ice floe could break away and drift into the open ocean, but Togo led them forward. He sensed the edge of the ice in complete darkness. At one point, their ice floe indeed broke away. They drifted in icy slush for several hours until they were driven ashore. Seppala grabbed Togo, jumped onto solid ground, and pulled the entire team with him. They covered 146 kilometers without a break on ice that was crumbling beneath their feet. And then came the final leg. Gunnar Kaasen and his dog Balto. The storm intensified so much that Kaasen couldn't see the dogs that were just a meter away from him. The wind flipped the sleds. Once, the box of serum flew into a snowdrift. In a panic, Kaasen dug through the snow with his bare hands, freezing his fingers until he felt the precious package. On February 2nd, at 5:30 in the morning, the exhausted team rolled into Nome. They had accomplished it in just 5.5 days. 5.5 days instead of 25. The medicine was in place. The children were saved. Kaasen was so exhausted he could hardly speak. He simply collapsed next to Balto and began clearing the ice from his dog's paws. Listen, this was a victory of pure, wild will and devotion, not of technology or engines. When Balto became famous and a statue was erected in New York, Seppala felt a bit hurt for his Togo. And I understand that. Togo went through hell. He went blind after that journey and never returned to run again. But he saved the town. This is a story about what happens when civilization falters, when engines shut down and machines turn into heaps of metal. Ancient instincts emerge. And sometimes, an old dog in a blizzard is all that stands between us and the abyss. But you know, sometimes, even the most heroic victory over nature pales in comparison to what people can do to one another, simply getting tangled up in their own fantasies, or due to one very strange message that came out of nowhere. This is story number 12. The magician who tamed an entire army with just one box. Tell me, do you believe in magic? Not the kind with rabbits and hats and trick cards, but the kind that can stop a war. Honestly, when it comes to diplomacy, we picture people in suits engaged in boring negotiations. However, in 1856, the French government decided they needed a magician instead of diplomats. Imagine, Algeria, the heat, the dust. A French colony hangs by a thread. Local tribes, incited by their spiritual leaders, the marabouts, are preparing for a great uprising. The marabouts perform miracles, eat glass, walk on coals, and convince warriors that their magic is stronger than French bullets. Gunpowder and steel are powerless against faith. And then Jean-Robert Houdin steps into the picture. For a moment, this is a man known as the father of modern magic. He is already retired, living in his estate near Paris, tinkering with gadgets. Yet the government asks him, travel to Algeria, show them that our magic is real. Robert Houdin agrees. He arrives in Algeria, not with cannons, but with a couple of wooden boxes and knowledge of physics that no one in the desert could fathom. The main event occurs in a vast tent packed with tribal leaders. Rugged men in turbans with daggers at their waists gaze at this frail Parisian in a black tailcoat with utter disdain. What can he possibly show us? Robert Houdin steps into the center. In his hands is a tiny wooden box with a metal handle, just minuscule. He places it on the ground. And now, he says through a translator, I will take the strength from the bravest among you. A massive warrior steps forward, muscular and confident. He easily lifts the box above his head. The marabouts laugh. What's the trick? But Robert Houdin makes a gesture with his hands. His face becomes serious. Now you are weak as a child. Try again. The warrior bends down, grabs the handle, and nothing. The box doesn't budge. The man strains, the veins on his neck bulge. He literally turns red from the effort, but the box is as if it is rooted in the ground. He tries to lift it with both hands, bracing his feet on the ground. Useless. The little box, weighing only a couple of kilograms, has become heavier than a mountain. Silence falls in the tent. The air is thick with the smell of camel wool and fear. The warrior steps back, breathing heavily. He is humiliated. He, the lion slayer, could not lift a lady's jewelry box. Robert Houdin smiles. He gestures once more, and the box becomes light again. It is lifted by a little boy. You know what the secret was? Science. The floor was fitted with a powerful electromagnet, a novelty of that time. The bottom of the box was made of iron. When the assistant backstage sent a current through it, not even a dozen horses could have lifted the box from the floor. But that was not the end. Robert Houdin decided to further undermine their authority. He offered the marabout a chance to shoot him with a real combat rifle. The chief fired a shot. Robert Houdin caught the bullet with his teeth. In reality, he had simply swapped the bullet for a wax one, which disintegrated in the barrel, and secretly hid the real one in his mouth. But for the people in the tent, this was the end. They decided that if the French could control the weight of objects and catch bullets with their teeth, then it was madness to fight against them. The uprising was quashed without a single shot fired. One magician in a worn tailcoat accomplished more than an entire army. Robert Houdin returned to France, received the Order of the Legion of Honor, and promptly retired again. He proved that knowledge is not just power, it is real magic. Listen, this makes you think. We often believe our eyes, not realizing that behind the scenes, someone is simply pushing a button. Yet sometimes, what happens right in front of us cannot be explained by any science, especially when it comes to a person who has decided to challenge death itself in a situation from which there is no escape. Story number 13. A rebellion born from straw. Have you ever wondered how fragile our civilization is? We build skyscrapers, write laws, conduct important negotiations, but sometimes it only takes one tiny insignificant detail for a crowd to turn into an uncontrollable mob. And frankly, in this story, that detail was an ordinary straw hat. New York, 1922, September. Back then, fashion was not just a recommendation, it was a sacred scripture. Men in New York had an unwritten rule. Straw boaters could only be worn until September 15th. That was that. If you stepped out in a straw hat after the 16th, you were officially considered a public nuisance and a target for ridicule. This was known as Felt Hat Day. Everyone had to switch to heavy felt. Usually, this ended with teenagers simply knocking hats off passers-by and stomping on them. A silly, foolish tradition, but that year, something went wrong. September 13th. Yes, it wasn't even the coveted 15th yet. A group of young guys in the Mulberry Bend decided that waiting for the official date was just too boring. They started snatching hats off the heads of workers returning home through the docks. But the workers were not office clerks. These were tough guys who were used to answering a blow with a blow. A fight broke out. A small scuffle, like hundreds before it. But the next day, pure chaos began. Imagine it. The streets of New York filled with gangs of teenagers. There were hundreds, then thousands. They armed themselves with sticks, with nails driven into the ends. Why? To snatch hats right off the heads of passers-by. But merely knocking off a hat was not enough for them. They craved blood. They attacked men in alleyways. They stormed trams, dragging passengers out onto the street. If you wore a straw hat, you were the enemy. Thousands of young people marched down Broadway shouting threats. This was not a joke. This was urban warfare. The police were in shock. They tried to disperse the crowd, but the rioters simply ran to the neighboring street. At one point, a gang of 1,000 people captured a bridge, stopping every vehicle and checking the drivers' heads. Those who refused to remove their hats were beaten until unconscious. Dozens of people ended up in hospitals with fractures and serious injuries. The fighting lasted for 8 days. 8 days, and the city was in turmoil over scraps of woven straw. You know what's most absurd? Some newspapers at the time almost justified the rioters. They claimed that men should adhere to rules of decency. However, hold on, beating people with clubs full of nails is, in their view, a matter of decency. The riots only quieted down when heavy rains began, and it became simply too cold to wear straw. The police finally made mass arrests. Many teenagers were sent to jail, and the courts were overwhelmed with lawsuits for property damage. This story serves as a vivid reminder of how easily fashion rules can become a justification for violence. We laugh about it today, but that week in New York, no one was laughing. One small tradition nearly set the city ablaze. By the way, after that year, the tradition of knocking off hats began to gradually die out. People realized that life is more valuable than a neighbor's opinion on your headwear. Even now, when we see something wrong with a passerby's clothing, we sometimes get awakened by that little savage from 1922. The main thing is not to give him a club, and sometimes what appears to be mass madness is actually the result of cold mathematical calculation, or a monumental mistake that had been hidden for decades. Story number 14. The war that ended faster than your lunch. You know, we tend to think of war as something endless. Years in the trenches, decades of conflict, generations growing up under the roar of cannon fire. But in history, there was a case where everything from the first shot to complete surrender took less time than your favorite sitcom episode, or while you're waiting for a pizza delivery. Imagine this. On August 27, 1896, in Zanzibar. A hot morning, the air smelling of cloves and the sea. A heavy, sticky tension hung over the palace of Sultan Khalid ibn Bargash. The Sultan had just seized power following the death of his predecessor. But the British Empire had other plans. They wanted to see their man on the throne. The ultimatum was simple and stern. Surrender by 9 o'clock in the morning, or we will open fire. Khalid, to be frank, was not the cowardly type, or perhaps too overconfident. He barricaded himself in the palace with 3,000 soldiers. He wheeled out old cannons onto the shore. He even armed his only yacht, the Glasgow, which gently bobbed in the harbor. He thought the English were bluffing, but the English never bluff. At 9 o'clock, 5 British warships were anchored outside. On the decks, sailors stood poised at the cannons. The silence was so profound that the cries of seagulls could be heard. The captain on the flagship looked at his watch. 9:01. The signal went out, and hell broke loose. The first salvo of explosive shells turned the Sultan's palace, this ornate wooden building, into a mound of splinters and dust. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The British cannons fired with such accuracy that every shell found its target. The palace was engulfed in flames. The Sultan's soldiers were in a state of panic. And what about Glasgow, the pride of the Zanzibar fleet? It attempted to fire at the British cruiser. That was rather cute. In response, the British simply fired a single volley. The yacht began sinking instantly. The most surreal aspect of this scene was that on the sinking ship, the British flag still flew, which the Sultan had forgotten to take down because the yacht was a gift from Queen Victoria. Khalid ibn Bargash witnessing his empire disintegrate, would not wait for the end. He dashed out of the palace through the back exit and ran toward the German consulate. You see, he ran so fast that his soldiers didn't immediately realize they were fighting alone. At 9:40, it was all over in 38 minutes. Just 38 minutes of tumultuous fire. 500 people from Zanzibar were killed or wounded. The British had one lightly injured sailor. The Sultan's flag was shot down. The gunfire ceased, and the smoke slowly began to settle over the ruins. This was the shortest official war in human history. Do you know what's most ironic? The British later even sent the new Sultan a bill for the ammunition they used to destroy the palace. They said, "We were working here for you. Please cover the expenses." This story is a harsh lesson about what happens when the ambitions of a tiny state clash with the cold logic of a great empire. Sometimes, it's better to take off your watch and walk away than to try to argue with naval cannons. 38 minutes of shame, and the world would forever remember your name. But while technology and caliber settled it here, in the next story, it all hinges on just one person. A person trapped in time and space and sought in places where the living typically do not venture. Story number 15. A fleet with a taste for caramel. You know, the Cold War was not just about spy games, nuclear missiles, and stern faces of general secretaries. Sometimes it's about soda. Yes, ordinary fizzy drinks that we are used to buying at any kiosk. But by the late 80s, this beverage transformed an ordinary American corporation into a formidable maritime power. Honestly, if you had told the admirals of the beginning of the century about this, they would have thought you were overindulging in schnapps. Imagine, it is 1989, the Soviet Union. Perestroika is in full swing. People in Moscow are queuing for everything from bread to jeans. But there is one thing they love above all else. Pepsi Cola. Soviet citizens were consuming billions of bottles of this black, sweet liquid. But there was one tiny problem, as huge as an iceberg. The USSR had no currency, no real hard dollars to pay for the syrup, and the Soviet ruble was worth about as much abroad as a candy wrapper. It could not be exchanged on the world market. So the parties had to get creative. Initially, Pepsi was exchanged for Stolichnaya vodka, barter, pure classic. But by the late 80s, the Americans could no longer sell as much vodka in the US as the Russians drank soda. A new product was needed, something substantial, something very metallic. And so, in May 1989, the world shook. The Soviet government and PepsiCo signed a contract. Listen, this sounds like the ramblings of a madman. In exchange for soda concentrate, the USSR handed over an entire fleet to the corporation. 17 submarines, a destroyer, a frigate, a cruiser, and even several massive oil tankers. For one brief surreal moment, the company known for making bubbles possessed the 6th largest military fleet in the world. Imagine the Pepsi board of directors in New York. They are sitting in their expensive chairs, drinking soda, while metaphorically speaking, 75 diesel submarines sway on the waves outside their windows. It's absurd. The company's president, Donald Kendall, even joked in a conversation with the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." And honestly, he was not exaggerating too much. Of course, Pepsi had no intention of invading neighboring countries or patrolling the oceans. They didn't need torpedo tubes or radar systems. What they needed was scrap metal. This entire fleet, rusting, old, but still impressive, was sold for scrap in Sweden and Norway. The corporation simply wanted to recoup its investment. But the fact remains, a private company selling Sweetwater suddenly gained enough power in one day to wipe a small nation off the map. You know, that's the essence of that era. The world was changing so quickly that logic couldn't keep pace with events. Weapons that had terrified the planet for decades suddenly became currency for purchasing fizz. It was a victory of sugar over gunpowder, the most peaceful and strangest transfer of armaments in history. But while at one end of the world, submarines were exchanged for syrup, on the other end, people were doing something that couldn't be measured in money or metal. They were challenging fate where hope of rescue seemed impossible, and sometimes they were saved only by a miracle, or one very small but crucial detail that everyone overlooked. Story number 16. An advertisement that blew up Texas. Listen, have you ever wondered what people would do for a good show? Honestly, we complain today about intrusive online ads, but imagine a time when to advertise a railroad, marketers had the idea to simply destroy two massive trains in rubble before the eyes of a huge crowd. It was 1953, Texas. William Crash, an agent of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, is scratching his head. He needs to boost ticket sales, and he comes up with a plan that sounds like a madman's dream. Let's orchestrate a head-on collision of two trains, he tells his superiors. And, astonishingly, they agree. They chose a site 30 kilometers from Waco. A whole town sprang up in just a few days on that empty land. They named it Crash. It had water, restaurants, attractions, and even a temporary jail. A ticket to this show cost only $2. September 15th. The heat is so intense that the air shimmers. 40,000 people gather in the plains. 40. 0 is more than the population of most cities in Texas at that time. People arrived in families, with children and picnic baskets. They were waiting for a spectacle. At opposite ends of a specially laid track stood two other monsters. Locomotive number 629, painted bright red, and number 642, a deep green. Beautiful, powerful machines. William Crash rode out to the middle of the track on a white horse. He waved his hat. This was the signal. The engineers opened the valves and jumped down. The trains began to slowly pick up speed. Faster, even faster. 40,000 people held their breath. The roar of steam, the rumble of the earth. The two trains raced toward each other at a speed of 70 kilometers per hour each. The total impact power was simply beyond the understanding of people in the 19th century. And then came the moment of silence, followed by the deafening crash of steel. But what Crash hadn't accounted for happened. The engineers had sworn to him that the boilers would not explode. They were wrong. At the moment of impact, both boilers detonated simultaneously. Imagine two giant fragmentation bombs. Thousands of pieces of glowing iron shot into the sky. They flew like bullets. Chaos erupted in the crowd. People ran, but there was nowhere to hide from the metal raining down from above. A huge bolt hit a photographer right in the eye. Pieces of the casing mowed people down like grass. This was not a show. It was a slaughter. When the smoke cleared, all that remained at the collision site was a mound of twisted, smoking metal and blood on the dusty grass. At least 3 people died. Hundreds were injured. William McCrash was fired that same evening. But you know what's the craziest part of this story? He was hired back the very next morning. Do you know why? Because every newspaper in the world reported on the incident. The railroad received publicity it could have only dreamed of. People continued to buy tickets just to pass by the spot where the trains exploded. Human curiosity is a terrifying thing. We are willing to pay for risk, for blood, for someone else's madness. Crash understood this. He turned tragedy into legend. And honestly, looking at modern blockbusters, knowing that we haven't changed much since then, we still need something to go bang loudly. But sometimes, to witness something truly magnificent and terrifying, you don't need to blow anything up. Simply looking at a world map will suffice. There, among the oceans, lie secrets that humans have been unable to decipher for centuries. And one of them involves an island that appears and disappears, driving cartographers crazy. Story number 17. The day the sky fell into the harbor. Listen, have you ever wondered how thin the line is between an ordinary winter morning and the complete end of the world? We plan our day, drink coffee, argue about trivialities. Meanwhile, two ships in a narrow strait simply cannot agree on who should yield, and in 5 minutes, the city ceases to exist. On December 6, 1917, Canada, the city of Halifax. The First World War was ongoing. Halifax at that time resembled a giant anthill. Ships carrying troops, coal, food, and weapons were shuttling back and forth, preparing to leap across the Atlantic. A Norwegian ship named Emo is entering the harbor in a hurry. Heading towards it is a French truck named Mont Blanc. To be honest, Mont Blanc was the most dangerous object in the world at that moment. It was filled to the brim with 2,300 tons of picric acid, 500 tons of TNT, and dozens of barrels of benzene right on the deck. This was not a ship. It was a giant bomb on which someone decided to take a ride. In the narrow strait, the captains became confused by the signals. One horn, two horns, misunderstandings. Emo crashed into the starboard side of Mont Blanc. It wasn't a hard hit, just a small dent, but that was enough. The barrels of benzene on Mont Blanc's deck burst open. The liquid flowed into the hold where the explosives were stored. A shower of sparks from the impact ignited a fire. The crew of Mont Blanc, knowing what was beneath their feet, didn't play heroes. They jumped into the lifeboats and paddled toward the shore as if all the demons of hell were chasing them. They shouted, "Run, it's going to blow!" But they shouted in French. In an English-speaking Halifax, no one understood them. A strange, terrifying pause followed. The burning ship drifted toward the shore until it crashed into the pier. Now, imagine the scene. It was morning. A bright fire in the port, black smoke rising. What does a person do? Naturally, they go to see what's happening. People flocked to the waterfront. Hundreds of workers abandoned their tasks. School children pressed their noses against the window panes. It was so intriguing, a big fire. No one knew what was inside Mont Blanc. To them, it was just a burning steamship. At 9:40 in the morning, the most powerful man-made explosion before the invention of the atomic bomb occurred. In a single millisecond, Mont Blanc ceased to be a solid body. It turned into superheated gas. The temperature at the epicenter reached 5,000 degrees. The shock wave traveled at speeds over 1,000 meters per second, literally wiping away every building within a radius of 2 kilometers. Trees were uprooted and splintered into dust. But the most horrifying consequences happened in homes. Those very people who were watching from their windows. The blast wave turned window panes into billions of tiny knives. Thousands of people were blinded in an instant, and then came the water. The explosion displaced the water from the harbor, revealing the seabed. Then it returned as an 18-meter tsunami, washing away everything that had survived the fire. You know what best illustrates the power of this madness? The anchor of Mont Blanc, weighing half a ton, was found 4 kilometers from the port. It had been thrown over forests and hills, while a cannon from the deck was flung 5.5 kilometers in the opposite direction. A massive piece of steel from the hull crashed onto the roof of a house in a nearby settlement, piercing it through. The city turned into a smoldering wasteland. Almost 2,000 people died instantly. 9,000 were injured. The next morning, a fierce snowstorm, the strongest in decades, hit the ruins of Halifax. Survivors froze to death under the rubble of their own homes. But even in this tragedy, there were heroes. Railroad dispatcher Vince Coleman stayed at his post. He knew that a passenger train carrying 300 people was headed toward the city. He managed to tap out a message on the telegraph. "Stop the train. A munitions ship is on fire and heading toward the pier. Goodbye." He died on the spot, but the train stopped outside the death zone. This is a story about how a small navigation error can lead to a catastrophe of planetary scale. We build fragile walls, yet sometimes reality itself seems to burst at the seams. By the way, after this tragedy, the rules for transporting hazardous materials in ports were changed forever. But the memory of that day still lives on in Goldhake. Every year at 9 in the morning, bells ring in memory of the day when the harbor exploded into the clouds. Sometimes, what was meant to destroy us suddenly becomes the beginning of something entirely different, something that challenges the very logic of human existence. Story number 18. The Geniuses from Cell Number 2. Have you ever wondered what lies behind everyday things? For instance, behind a dictionary? We open it whenever we don't know how to spell the word precedent or what differentiation means. Dry pages, strict font, academic precision. It seems like it was written by boring people in dusty libraries. But honestly, one of the greatest dictionaries in the history of humanity, the Oxford Dictionary, was partly created by a man who was at that time locked in a chamber for insane killers. And this is not a metaphor. The end of the 19th century, England. Professor James Murray takes on an impossible task to compile all the words of the English language with examples of their usage from the past few hundred years. It's a titanic undertaking. Murray sends out a call. Help us. Send in cards with quotes from books. And soon his mailbox begins to fill up with letters. These were perfect letters, calligraphic handwriting, profound understanding of literature, thousands of cards with references to the rarest publications of the 15th and 16th centuries. The sender was named Dr. William Chester Minor. Address: Crowthorne, Berkshire. For 20 years. Imagine, for 20 years, this man sends tens of thousands of quotes. Murray is thrilled. He thinks of Minor as a great scholarly recluse who is simply too modest to come to Oxford for a formal dinner. The professor writes to him, "Come, we want to shake your hand." But Minor always declines politely yet firmly. Finally, in 1896, Murray can't take it anymore. He boards a train and goes to Crowthorne himself. He wants to see this genius. He arrives at a massive, grim brick building with high walls. He is greeted by the director. Murray bows and says, "I have come to see Dr. Minor. I hope he is at home." The director looks at him with a strange mixture of pity and astonishment. "Professor, you seem to be misunderstanding. Dr. Minor is indeed here, but this is Broadmoor, a psychiatric facility for criminals, and William Minor is our most dangerous patient." Murray was crushed. It turned out that William Minor was an American military surgeon, a brilliant doctor who had endured the horrors of the Civil War in the United States. There, he lost his mind. He imagined that Irish spies were sneaking under his bed at night to torture him. He fled to England hoping to escape from the ghosts. But the ghosts followed him. On a cold February night in 1872, Minor jumped out of bed, grabbed a revolver, and ran outside. He thought that someone had just stepped out of his room. He saw an ordinary passerby, a simple worker named George Moret, who was heading to his shift. Minor shot him in the back, killing him instantly. The court declared him insane. He was locked up in Broadmoor forever, and there, in a cell filled with books from floor to ceiling, this man found his salvation. He decided that if he could not control his demons, he would control words. He read voraciously, writing down every rare phrase, every forgotten meaning. Working on the dictionary became his only connection to reality, the only way to atone for the life he had taken. The most astonishing thing? Do you know what it is? Murray did not turn away from him. They became friends. The professor regularly visited the murderer in his cell, and for hours they debated the origins of words while the guards jingled keys outside the door. William Minor gifted us hundreds of pages of the history of our language while imprisoned in his own nightmares. The next time you open a dictionary, remember him. The man who pieced together the world in cell number 2. Sometimes, light is born in the darkest depths, and sometimes, the darkness is so thick that entire expeditions vanish within it, leaving only unanswered questions and ice that never melts. Story number 19. 99 Days on the Brink of Madness. Listen, have you ever felt that thrill? Not the kind you get when you put a penny in a lottery, but the kind that makes your teeth clench and your heart race somewhere in your throat when enormous amounts of money, reputation, and frankly, your life are at stake. Imagine a world without motors, without satellites, without radio. Just wood, sails, and the endless ocean. And 2 captains who decided that 99 days of racing was the best way to prove who was in charge. May 1860, China, the port of Fuzhou. The air is thick with the smell of tea, so intense it feels like you could cut it with a knife. The fresh harvest. For London, this is not just tea for breakfast, it is gold. Those who bring the first tea of the new season will hit the jackpot, a reward for every ton. Glory is at stake. The clippers are anchored, the most beautiful and fastest ships ever created by man. Sleek, long, with masts as tall as a 20-story building, Ariel and Taiping. The other two, while technically wooden, are the fastest racers of the ocean. On the 30th of May, they finished loading almost simultaneously. Just hours apart, they weighed anchor and set out to sea. The Great Tea Race had begun. Imagine this journey. 16,000 miles, that's 25,000 kilometers, through 3 oceans. Around Africa, through storms, calms, and fogs. 99 days. And all that time, listen closely, they could almost always see each other. Captain Keely on Ariel and Captain McKinnon on Taiping were made of different stuff. They went days without sleep. They pushed the sailors to set extra sails, even where the masts were already creaking from the wind. The risk was enormous. One wrong turn of the wheel, one too strong wave, and the clipper could go down with all its crew and precious tea. But they did not slow down. They crossed the equator. We sailed around with Good Hope and passed through the Atlantic. And then, on the 6th of September, the English Channel, the Strait of Dover. Imagine the faces of the lookouts on the shore. Morning. The fog is slowly lifting, and out of this white shroud, with all their massive sails unfurled, 2 ships emerge, side by side, bow to bow. After 3 months of journeying, after thousands of kilometers, they are so close that the sailors can shout to each other. It was madness. It was impossible. They raced up the Thames. The wind whistled through the rigging. The decks were drenched with water. Ariel surged ahead by several cable lengths, but Taiping did not give up. The captains pushed their ships to the limit, and even a bit more. They needed to pick up a pilot, a person who would guide the ship through the complicated docks of London. Ariel was the first to signal, but the pilot boat was closer to Taiping, and it was here that luck smiled on McKinnon. The pilot boarded Taiping several minutes earlier. They raced up the river. The citizens of London stopped their work and ran out to the embankments. The city had never seen such a spectacle. 2 giant clouds of white canvas sped along the narrow river, barely avoiding each other's sides. At 9:45 in the evening, Taiping touched the dock. Just 20 minutes later, only 20 minutes later, Ariel moored to the neighboring pier. A 20-minute difference after 99 days at sea. Just pause and think about those numbers. This is statistical error. This is a miracle. Do you know how it all ended? The cargo owners were so shocked by this skill that they decided to split the prize evenly. No one wanted to offend the loser because there were no losers in this race. There were 2 great captains and 2 perfect ships. This marked the sunset of the sail era. In a few years, the Suez Canal would open, and steamships would arise. They would be dull, smoky, and reliable. The romance would disappear, and the clippers would fade into history. But that race of 1866 remains forever in the memories of sailors as the pinnacle of human perseverance. By the way, Ariel later vanished in the ocean, went on a voyage, and never returned. Perhaps he is still trying to outpace the wind somewhere beyond the horizon. But while here, people battled the elements for tea and glory. In the next story, a person fought against nature itself to save what cannot be bought for any money. And his weapon was not a sail, but silence, and one very strange decision. Story number 20. The city that buried itself alive. On the 6th of June in a certain year, Seattle. At that time, it was not a city of technology, but a pile of wooden structures, smelling of fish and sawdust. The heat was unbearable. And then, in a small furniture workshop, a certain John Beck decided to heat glue. Just a pot of glue. He got distracted and the glue ignited. John poured water on it, making things only worse. The hot liquid spread over the sawdust and, within an hour, Seattle turned into one giant bonfire. 31 blocks were burned to the ground, a huge wasteland on the bay's shore. It seemed like a tragedy, but the residents of Seattle were tough people. They looked at the ashes and said, "Great, now we can finally do it right." You see, the old Seattle had one terrible problem: mud. The city was situated in a low area, and during high tides, water from the bay flooded the streets, turning them into a stinky swamp. Horses would drown in this muck right at the major intersections. And then the city engineers made a crazy decision. They decided to raise the entire city by 3, 5, and in some places even 10 meters. But how could they do this? You can't just lift buildings with jacks like in Chicago. It's too expensive. So they built stone walls along the streets, filled the gaps with dirt, and laid new roads at the level of the second floors. And this is where true surrealism began. Imagine Seattle in the 1890s. You are walking along a new sidewalk which is at the height of the third floor of an old building. To the right of you is the entrance to a new shop, and to the left, a chasm, literally a deep canyon, down at the bottom of which the old life still continues. To get to the barbershop that remained below, you had to descend a long, shaky wooden staircase. It was dangerous. People, especially drunken sailors, often fell from these makeshift sidewalks into the darkness. 17 people died just trying to cross the street. But the city continued to grow. Over time, the building owners realized that this was inconvenient. They started moving entrances to the new upper floors and simply covered the old first floors with glass panels and concrete slabs. The city administration said, "That's it, now forget about this basement." And Seattle forgot for a full 30 years. The underground city became a dark labyrinth. There were dens and mountain halls and illegal bars. During Prohibition, rivers of whiskey flowed there while law-abiding citizens went to church above. It was home to those who had no place in the light. But in 1907, there was an outbreak of the plague. The authorities feared that rats from the underground would destroy the city. They simply sealed off all the entrances, put up grates, affixed seals, and an entire layer of city history was preserved in darkness. Imagine if you went down there today. Dust an inch thick, old bank vaults that no one could carry away, the displays of pharmacies with bottles long devoid of medicine, concert posters from a century ago. And all of this under the rumble of the modern city. You can hear tires on the pavement above you and the click of heels from passers-by. You are in a ghostly world that Seattle simply chose to step over. It is both frightening and awe-inspiring at the same time. We walk on the bones of old cities, unaware of how close the past is to us. Sometimes it lies just 30 centimeters of concrete beneath your feet. But while Seattle simply buried its problems, in the next story, a man decided that he could deceive not just space, but the very logic of human senses. For the sake of love, he created something that made the whole world shudder. And it was not a fairy tale. Story number 21. Footprints that a person could not leave behind. Tell me, do you believe that fear has a scent or a sound? Honestly, nowadays, when everyone has a high-resolution camera in their pocket, we tend to think that every miracle can be explained. A reflection of light, a glare, photo manipulation. But imagine a world where the only source of light at night was an oil lamp, with nothing outside but a dense forest and an icy wind. And in that darkness, sometimes things occur that make entire counties lock their doors tight and pray until dawn. On February 8, 1855, England, Devon County. The night was unusually harsh. Thick, heavy snow was falling, covering hills and rooftops with a white shroud. The residents of small villages along the coast were peacefully sleeping in their beds, enjoying the warmth of their hearths. A typical winter night. Silence. But when morning arrived, it was that moment when the familiar world just fell apart. The first passers-by began to notice strange marks in the fresh snow. They were tracks, but not human and not canine. Imagine a distinct hoof print, a cloven hoof, about 4 inches long and about 3 inches wide. But the most chilling part was not the shape. The most chilling part was how these tracks were arranged. They went in a straight line, one after the other, as if the creature that left them was moving on 2 legs, placing one foot directly in front of the other. The step was perfectly measured at exactly 8 inches between the prints throughout the county. People began to leave their homes. They followed the tracks, and their faces grew pale. Listen, this was not a stroll through the woods. This was some kind of otherworldly nightmare. The tracks went through locked gardens. They ascended vertical walls 4 meters high. They traveled across rooftops, as if gravity was simply a joke to this creature. The trail would reach a tall wall, stop, and then reappear exactly in the same spot on the other side, at the very top. No signs of jumping, no snow falling, just a smooth chain of hooves marching along the ridge of the roof. In one place, the tracks led to a narrow pipe, only 6 inches in diameter. They approached it from one side and emerged from the other. It was as if the creature had seeped through iron. In another area, the prince went into a closed haystack and exited without disturbing a single straw. Panic engulfed Devon within a few hours. The distance covered by these tracks was astonishing, over 100 miles. And all of this in one night across both sides of the Exe River through 5 or 6 different settlements, people whispered. It's the devil. He has crossed our lands to count the sinners. Men took up pitchforks and guns, heading out to hunt. But whom were they going to track? The air? The void? The newspapers of that time, including the reputable Times, babbled with reports. Scientists attempted to construct theories. It's badgers, some said. But badgers do not walk on 2 legs across roofs for 100 miles in a night. It's field mice, claimed others. But mice do not leave hoof prints that are 4 inches wide. Perhaps it was a kangaroo that escaped from a private zoo? That was the most popular version. But kangaroos do not pass through walls and do not leave cloven hooves. More than 150 years have passed. We still don't know what it was. You know what's the strangest part? Similar incidents have happened before. In 1909 in New Jersey, in the 50s in Scotland, and even quite recently, in 2009, in the same place, a woman found exactly the same footprints in her garden after a night snowfall. The same hooves, the same perfect straight line. What is this? A mass hallucination? A rare atmospheric anomaly where water droplets freeze in strange shapes? Or is someone really walking on our roofs while we close our eyes? To be honest, sometimes it's better not to know the answer. This story leaves behind a sticky feeling of vulnerability. We think our home is our fortress, but for whoever left those tracks, it doesn't exist. However, sometimes dangers come not from the mystical dark, but from the very heart of human society, from people who seem ordinary, but hold secrets inside capable of destroying all living things for hundreds of miles around. And the scariest part is that they do it with a smile on their face. Story number 22. Bombs coming from silence. Listen, have you ever thought that the greatest danger is not what loudly announces itself with explosions and sirens? True fear is quiet. It comes from where you least expect it, not from there at all. Honestly, we are used to thinking that war is tanks, airplanes, or, at the very least, spies in cloaks. But imagine a situation. You are walking through the woods, the sun is shining, birds are singing, and suddenly you find an ordinary balloon, beautiful, paper, peacefully lying in the bushes. And in a second, the world comes crashing down. May 1945, the state of Oregon, deep in the countryside, the United States. World War II is happening somewhere out across the oceans. People here are living their usual peaceful lives. Pastor Archie Mitchell decides to throw a small celebration for his pregnant wife Elsie and their 5 children from Sunday school. A picnic in nature. What could be safer? They head to the mountains, find a cozy clearing. Elsie and the children jump out of the car and run toward the trees while Archie parks. And then the children scream, "Dad, look, there's some huge balloon!" Archie doesn't even have time to open his mouth. There's an explosion. A single, short, and frightening one. When the smoke cleared, Archie found his family lying on the grass. 5 children and his wife were killed instantly. They became the only casualties of the war on the mainland of America. And it wasn't a soldier who killed them. It was paper and wind that did. But wait, where did bombs come from in the forests of Oregon? This was one of the craziest and most secret developments of the Japanese army. The Fugo Project. In 1944, Japanese engineers came up with a brilliant yet horrifying idea. They realized that at high altitudes, there are air currents blowing directly from Japan towards America, jet streams. They decided to use them as free transportation for death. They crafted 9,000 enormous balloons out of paper, ordinary mulberry paper. 9,000. They filled them with hydrogen, attached incendiary and shrapnel bombs, and released them into the sky. This was the first intercontinental weapon in history. No engines, no pilots, just physics and hope for luck. The balloons were supposed to fly 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, descend over the forests of the United States, and spark giant fires. Panic, chaos, and the diversion of resources from the front. That was the plan. And you know what's the strangest part? It worked. The balloons began to be discovered all over America, in Wyoming, in Montana, even in Canada. One of them got tangled in power lines and temporarily cut off electricity to the factory that produced components for the first atomic bomb. The US government was horrified at the possibility of the Japanese attaching biological weapons to these balloons, like anthrax or plague. And then, the authorities made a decision that now seems unthinkable. They imposed complete, total censorship. Not a single line in the newspapers, not a word on the radio. Americans were finding wreckage from the balloons in fields, bringing it to their sheriffs, who would say, "It's just debris from weather balloons, forget it." People were dying of curiosity, but the press stayed silent. The Japanese were listening to American radio. They were waiting for news about the fires. They were waiting for panic. But there was silence on the airwaves, not even a mention. A month passed, then 2, then 3. And in Tokyo, they decided the project had failed. Not a single balloon completed its journey. They thought their idea was simply a dud and closed the program, releasing only about 1,000 balloons out of the planned tens of thousands. The silence saved thousands of lives, but it also claimed the family of Pastor Mitchell. If they had known that Japanese mines could be lying in the woods, they would have never approached that balloon. Listen, this is a terrible dilemma. The truth that can cause panic or the lie that protects the country but leaves innocent people vulnerable. Archie Mitchell could never reconcile with that. A few years later, he simply vanished, disappeared somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They say he was trying to find answers to questions that no one wanted to give him. This is a story about how silence can be as powerful a weapon as gunpowder, and how we sometimes find ourselves at the epicenter of events we are completely unaware of. By the way, fragments of those balloons are still being found in the forests of America today. 80 years later, they lay there, covered in moss, still capable of killing. But if here, nature became an unwitting accomplice to man, in the next story, man will try to become God by creating something that will change the very taste of life. And it all begins with one small mistake in the laboratory. Story number 23. A reign of 8 tons of unfulfilled hopes. Listen, have you ever noticed that engineering thought has one strange trait? Sometimes it can be too grandiose. You know, it's when instead of taking a little shovel, a person grabs a box of dynamite and says, "Watch how I solve everything in one go." Honestly, at those moments, common sense usually steps out for a smoke and doesn't come back. And what happened in November 1970 in the state of Oregon is the best proof of that. Picture this, a beach in the town of Florence, the ocean shore, beautiful, noisy, smelling of salt. And in the midst of this idyllic scene lies a mountain, or rather, the carcass of a whale washed ashore, 14 meters long, 8 tons of rotting flesh. Within a couple of days, the smell became so overwhelming that seagulls began to circle the beach high above. Local residents pinched their noses, while city officials frantically pondered what to do. Bury it? That wouldn't work. The tide would just wash it away. Cut it into pieces and haul it off? No one wanted to get their hands dirty with this mess. And then, George Thornton, an engineer from the road department, stepped onto the scene, a man of action. He looked at the whale, squinted, and proposed a brilliant idea. We'll blow it up. I mean, why not? The logic seemed compelling. We'll place dynamite on one side of the carcass. Boom! An enormous wave of energy would simply vaporize the whale, or, at the very least, break it into such tiny pieces that crabs and seagulls would sweep it away in no time. Clean, quick, effective. On November 15th, a crowd gathered on the shore. Journalists with cameras, families with children. Everyone was waiting for a spectacle. George Thornton, like a true triumphant figure, ordered 20 boxes of dynamite to be placed under the whale, almost a half-ton of explosives. An experienced military man who happened to be in the crowd approached the engineer and whispered, "Buddy, that's too much. A couple of sticks would be enough." "You're just going to—" But George didn't listen. He believed in the power of progress. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know, the video recording from that day shows a gigantic, truly epic column of sand, smoke, and something red shooting into the sky. It looked like a rocket launch. The crowd gasped in amazement, but within seconds, the gasp turned into a scream of horror because what went up had to come down. But these weren't tiny pieces for the crabs. These were huge, heavy, slippery chunks of whale blubber the size of a nightstand, and they were flying straight at the spectators. Imagine standing 400 meters from the blast, enjoying life, when suddenly a 20-kilogram chunk of whale falls from the sky. Chaos erupted. People ran to their cars, covering their heads with their hands. A rain of rotten meat descended upon the parking lot. One colossal lump of blubber, flying in a perfect parabola, landed directly on the roof of a brand-new Oldsmobile, turning it into a metal pancake. The car's owner, who had come to watch the show, just stood there with his mouth agape. The car was completely crushed. And what about the whale? When the smoke cleared, it turned out that most of the carcass remained right where it was. The explosion simply blew out a massive hole beneath it and scattered the area with a sticky layer of stinky blubber. The seagulls, which Thornton had counted on, flew away in horror and didn't return for several days. They were apparently stunned as well. The engineer had to quickly orient himself amidst a hail of curses and rotting debris. Ultimately, the whale had to be buried by hand, using the very method that initially seemed too time-consuming. This story became a legend. It teaches us that sometimes the simplest solution is just an illusion. And if you decide to blow up a problem with dynamite, be prepared for it to come back to you in the form of 8 tons of fat raining down. By the way, that Oldsmobile went down in advertising history. Its owner later attempted to claim insurance for the damage from the whale. However, while human folly led to farce here, the next story shows how one person's mistake turned an ordinary trip into a nightmare that lasted for years. And there were no explosions, just the soft rustle of snow and absolute loneliness. Story number 24. Photographs from the Kingdom of the Dead. Have you ever wondered what oblivion looks like? Not the kind written about in books, but the real thing. When you slip into the void and the world crosses your name off the lists of the living for decades. Silence, cold, and an utter absence of answers. Honestly, we've grown accustomed to the idea that if someone goes missing, there are at least some traces left behind. But the Arctic does not like to leave traces. It prefers to keep them in the freezer, only to reveal the truth to those who no longer await it. July 1897, Spitsbergen Island. 3 men stand in the basket of a massive balloon called the Eagle. Their leader, Solomon André, a Swedish engineer, a man with a steely gaze and, frankly, a rather dangerous dream. He decided that he would reach the North Pole in this silk bubble filled with hydrogen. Imagine, the end of the 19th century, no radio, navigation by stars and compass. The balloon is guided only by the wind and long ropes trailing across the ice. Madness, of course, but the crowd on the shore is cheering. André waves his hat, the ropes are cut, and the Eagle slowly vanishes into the gray northern fog. 3 days later, the balloon disappeared. A year passed, 5 years, 10. The world had experienced the First World War. Empires crumbled, radio was invented, airplanes, television. Yet not a word was heard about Solomon André and his companions Nils Strindberg and Knut Frankel. They became ghosts, legends of men who flew into the sky and never returned. But the Arctic knows how to wait. August 1930. 33 years have gone by. 33. The vessel Bratvak happens upon the uninhabited White Island by chance. It's a chunk of rock covered in glaciers where very few people ever set foot. The sailors land and find an aluminum boat protruding from the snow, alongside skeletons, remnants of a camp, moldy diaries, and several rusty metal canisters. Inside these canisters were photographic films. Listen, this is incredible. The films lay under ice water for 33 years, covered by snow and wind. Any photographer would tell you that's a death sentence. The emulsion should have turned to mush, but the cold acted as a perfect preservative. When they were brought to Stockholm and handed over to experts, silence fell in the lab. Chemists labored over the reagents, and slowly, millimeter by millimeter from the abyss, outlines began to emerge. The world saw what happened after the Eagle broke through the fog. It turned out that the balloon had lasted only 65 hours in the air. It froze, became too heavy, and fell onto the ice. The three men found themselves in the midst of an endless, icy desert. In the photographs, they appear calm. Here they are standing against the backdrop of the fallen balloon. Here they are pulling heavy sleds through the ice ridges. In one of the shots, Strindberg even smiles, standing beside a shot white bear. They walked for 3 months. They walked towards land, battling the drifting ice that constantly swept them back north. They reached White Island, set up a tent, and fell silent. The most haunting aspect of these images is their ordinariness. These are not heroic poses from paintings. These are simply people who know they are going to die, yet continue to pull the trigger to capture their final journey. They filmed each other when their strength was already fading. You know what's most ironic about this? They were found precisely when technology had advanced so far that their flight in the balloon seemed like child's play. But these developed photographs brought them back to reality. They ceased to be a legend and once again became living people made of flesh, blood, and fear. This is a story about how nothing disappears without a trace. Time can freeze like ice, but eventually it will surely melt. And then the past will look us straight in the eyes through the lens of an old camera. But sometimes, what we find in the past is not just memories. It is a warning that even the brightest intentions can lead to the earth beneath our feet literally catching fire. And that fire can't be extinguished by any ocean in the world. Story number 25. The Dragon That Shouldn't Be Teased. Listen, have you ever played with something you absolutely shouldn't? You know, when that inner voice whispers, "Don't touch, it's dangerous." Yet you still reach out your hand. Honestly, every one of us has had such a moment in childhood. But when you are an adult scientist in a secret Los Alamos laboratory and you hold the heart of an atomic bomb in your hands, the price of curiosity becomes, let's say, final. May 21st, 1946, New Mexico. The war is already over. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are history. In the laboratory, there remained a small metal sphere weighing 6 kilograms of pure plutonium. It was called Rufus. It was meant for the third bomb that was never dropped. The scientists at Los Alamos were brilliant individuals, but to be honest, they were completely reckless. They conducted experiments to determine critical mass. This was called teasing the dragon by the tail. Why? Because you are balancing on the very edge of a nuclear explosion. The main tamer that day was Louis Slotin, a brilliant physicist and daredevil who always wore cowboy boots and blue jeans. He had performed this experiment dozens of times. Imagine, on the table lies that very plutonium sphere. Slotin covers it with a hemispherical shell of beryllium, a metal that reflects neutrons back into the core. If the sphere is covered completely, a chain reaction will start. Flash. Death. To prevent this from happening, a tiny gap must be left between the hemispheres. Slotin had his own method. No automatic clamps, no safety devices. He simply inserted a regular flat screwdriver between the metal halves and held it by hand, adjusting the gap with his eye to just millimeters. There were 7 other people in the room. They watched in silence. Only the dry crackle of the Geiger counters grew faster. Tick, 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 tick. And then Slotin's hand trembled. The ordinary kitchen screwdriver slipped out. The upper hemisphere fell onto the plutonium. The gap vanished. In that instant, The room was flooded with a blinding, otherworldly light, a blue flash. The air instantly became ozone-laden, sharp, metallic in taste. Slotin felt a wave of heat wash over his face. It was not fire. It was radiation. The dragon awoke. Do you know what Slotin did at that moment? He had a fraction of a second. He could have run away. He could have dropped to the floor. But with his bare hands, he grabbed the superheated upper hemisphere and yanked it upward. He tore apart the critical mass. He stopped the reaction. The Geiger counters went off the scale and then fell silent. They burned out. Slotin straightened up. He was calm. He looked at his colleagues, who were frozen in shock, and quietly said, "Well, that's it." He understood. He had received a dose of 1,000 Roentgens. It was a death sentence. No options. He sketched a diagram on the board showing where everyone was standing so that the medics would know how much radiation the others had received. He lived for 9 days. Those were 9 days of hell, which I won't detail because I promised no gruesome stories. Let's just say his body began to disintegrate at the atomic level, but he saved those 7 people. They survived because he did not let go of that sphere. Rufus was renamed after that. He became known as the Demonic Core. No one dared to approach him with a screwdriver again. Soon, he was melted down and turned into other parts to erase any memory of this metal that had killed people twice in peacetime. This is a story about how even the sharpest mind is not protected from foolishness, and that sometimes a single second of recklessness can cost an entire life. But while here, a man tried to tame the invisible power of the atom. In the next story, people faced a force that could be touched with their hands, a power that emerged from the depths of time and was so immense that a single glimpse of it made entire cities believe in the end of the world, or in God's decided to return to Earth. A man who fooled lead. Listen, have you ever wondered how many bullets it takes to stop a person? To be honest, in movies, we are shown that one is enough, but reality is much more ironic and far scarier than any Hollywood action film. In this story, there were 9. 9 pieces of lead that were supposed to put a period at the end of the sentence, but only managed to place a comma. March 1915, Mexico, Revolution. Dust, the smell of gunpowder, and cheap tequila. In this chaos, a human life was cheaper than a glass of water. Wenceslao Maguel was a young guy, a soldier who found himself on the wrong side. On an unfortunate day, he was captured. Without trial, without a word, he was sentenced to execution, a common occurrence for that time. Imagine this noon, the heat, a wall of unfired brick. Wenceslao stands before a line of 9 soldiers. 9 rifles are aimed straight at his heart. He does not beg for mercy. He simply waits. Fire. A volley. The noise is so loud that birds take flight from the surrounding trees. 9 bullets enter his body. Wenceslao falls to the dry ground. He does not move. He cannot move. His flesh has become a sieve. But a rule is a rule. To be 100% sure, the officer approaches the body lying on the ground. This is called a control shot. The officer pulls out his revolver, presses it against Wenceslao's temple, and pulls the trigger. The 10th bullet passes through his head, completely. Soldiers are leaving. They are laughing, smoking, discussing dinner. Who do they have to fear? A corpse. But the sky that day apparently decided that Wenceslao still had something to say to this world. Listen, it sounds like nonsense, I know. But a few hours later, the corpse opened his eyes. Among the bodies of his comrades, in a pool of his own blood with a hole in his head, he realized he was still breathing. The pain was so immense it couldn't be described. It could only be felt in every cell of his body. He couldn't scream. He could only crawl. And crawl he did. It took him several hours to reach the nearest church. A bloody trail on the dusty road. People who saw him crossed themselves and ran away. They thought they were witnessing a man from the afterlife, but the priest turned out to be a man of action. He hid him. He began treating him without antibiotics, without modern operating rooms, simply washing the wounds and hoping for a miracle. And the miracle happened. Wenceslao Maguel survived. Of course, he had changed. His face was forever distorted, like a frozen mask of horror. The bullet that passed through his jaw and temple left deep scars. But he lived. And not just lived, he lived for another 60 years. 60 years after he was officially shot and finished off. In the 30s, he became a worldwide celebrity. He came to the United States, appeared on the radio in the show Believe It or Not. People touched his scars and couldn't believe that he was a man and not a ghost. He became a living monument of human resilience. They nicknamed him El Fusilado, the one who was shot. Do you know what's the strangest part of this story? He never held a grudge against those soldiers. He said everyone has their job. His job was to survive, and he excelled at it. He died in old age, in his bed, surrounded by the silence he had longed for that March afternoon. This story marks the end of our journey. It is about the fact that even when the whole world is against you, when 10 bullets have been fired at you and a cross has been placed on your back, the last word always belongs to you. As long as you breathe, you are not defeated. Our archive is closing. Dust settles again on the folders. We have traveled through 30 incredible worlds, and I hope that now you see reality a little differently. It is not boring. It is unpredictable. It is the craziest show in the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through forgotten archives. Take care of yourselves. And remember, sometimes to witness a miracle, all you have to do is keep your gaze steady. Until we meet again in other stories.